welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show tonight. Well, we're going to be talking, you put the shows together and sometimes you just don't know how they fit. But tonight we're going to be speaking about spirituality and spiritualism and occultism and magic and all those secret things that no one wants to talk to you about because they're blasphemous. And to do that, we're going to be speaking with Mayo about the secret book of Francisco Madero, and in the second hour with Don Milo Duquette about magic and the occult. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healings, and psychic readings. So if there's stuff going on in your life, give me a call, send me an email, and we can set up a time for a private consultation to help you figure out what's going on and give you a clear path to move forward. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. And I have an important announcement from the Institute of Applied Energetics for this month only. So for the month of August, they're doing a back-to-school sale. Check out the webpage. They have incredible savings going on. That's www.AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com. In this first hour, we're going to be speaking to Mayo about her book, The Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution, which is really interesting. And let me tell you a little bit about her and bring her on the air. Well, we're just going to do the brief bio here. Award-winning writer and noted literary translator, Mayo provides a rich introduction and the first translation of the secret book by Francisco I. Madero, leader of Mexico's 1910 revolution and president of Mexico from 1911 to 1913. The book, again, is Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution. Her webpage is cmmayo.com. So please welcome to the show, Mayo. Hey, girl, how are you?
Oh, I'm great. Dr. Rita, I'm just thrilled to be on your show.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you about this, even though, at first it seemed a little weird, like, why am I going to be talking about the Mexican Revolution? But it all, there's always a plan, and I think it's all going to come together because I don't know, it was really interesting. So let's just kind of start here. I think this will be the best place to start, because we're going to be speaking about Francisco Madero, but I don't think anybody listening, well, I don't want to say anybody, but the vast majority of people listening don't have a clue who he is. So maybe we could start with an introduction to him, and an introduction because we'll get a little more detail, obviously, as we move forward to let people know who he is, what his deal was.
Yeah. Well, the 1910 revolution was the first major revolution of the 20th century. It is a formative episode in modern Mexico. And he was the leader. He proclaimed the 1910 revolution on November 20th with the Plan de San Luis Potosí. So the revolution went on for several years and had many other well-known figures. Probably most listeners have heard of Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata and figures like that. But the leader was Francisco Madero, and he launched the revolution, won the revolution. I guess you could call him the dictator, Porfirio Diaz, who had been continuously or almost continuously, well, it's complicated, but basically he had been in power or managing things from behind the scenes in power for 30 years. And he was into his 80s, and it looked like it was time for a real open election. And when Francisco Madero called for the open election, the dictator threw him in jail. And the response of Francisco Madero was to put together the revolution. Long story short, after winning the revolution, he held open and free elections, was elected president, and held that office until he was overthrown in a coup d'etat. So the super basic fact here is the revolution's important, not just for Mexico, but in the world. The Russian Revolution came shortly thereafter. There were revolutions in China and so on and so forth. So this is really a formative 20th century event. It's a formative event for Mexico and for Mexico's identity of, what is the modern Mexican Republic. All the school children learn this story, just like in the U.S., you learn about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Well, in Mexico, you have figures who had similar roles, and Francisco Madero is of that level of importance in Mexico. And so he's a very, very important figure for Mexicans in Mexican history. And the really amazing thing is that he was a spiritist medium. He was a practicing medium, and he believed that he was channeling through, writing messages from spirits that were directing him to launch the revolution. I should leap to explain, I'm not the first person to talk about this. There are other Mexican historians of importance who have written about this. Enrique Krause is one. Anyone who knows Mexican history will immediately recognize that name. He wrote a very important book that came out in the 80s. So many decades after the revolution, there was a book that came out that was Francisco Madero, Místico de la Libertad, or Mystic of Liberty, where it talked about the mediumistic notebooks and the channelings and so on and so forth. And there are some other academics and historians, Yolia Tortolero and Manuel Guerra de Luna and Alejandro Rosas Robles, and a very important novelist in Mexico, Ignacio Solares, wrote about this. But it's still something most people, including historians of the revolution and including people who teach and write about Mexican history, just don't know about or don't want to talk about. It makes them extremely uncomfortable. And their reaction to his spiritism is to either ignore it or just laugh at it and kind of shove it under the carpet. And so when I encountered the Spiritist Manual and very soon realized that he really did write this book in 1911. So he led the revolution in 1910 and published the Spiritist Manual, which is an evangelical book about Spiritism and about communicating with spirits, written as a spiritist, as a medium. I thought, well, wait a minute, 1911. That was the year he was elected president. This is the leader of the revolution. So whatever's in that book, whether you believe it or not, it's important. Mm-hmm. And I'm a translator, so long story short, I offered to translate it, and I got a Xerox copy of the book, which a few years ago was very difficult to find. I encountered it in his archive, which is in the Mexican Ministry of Finance, holds the Francisco Madero personal archive with the mediumistic notebooks. Now you can, if you Google, you'll get a PDF of it. Anyone can look at it now, but a few years ago it wasn't possible. So I got a Xerox copy of it from the archive and translated it. But at that time it was new to me, so I needed to do quite a bit of work to make sense out of it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question, and you can laugh, but I know zero about Mexican history. And when we talk about this revolution that happened in 1910, that's not where like Cinco de Mayo came from, is it?
No, Cinco de Mayo, a lot of people are confused about Cinco de Mayo, which means May 5th. That actually is the commemoration of the Army of the Mexican Republic defeating the French in Puebla during the French intervention. It's not Mexico's Independence Day. It's the commemoration of a battle, a very important battle, a very meaningful battle, but just a battle. Oh. Back in the 19th century.
And so it's not even part of the same conflict or...
No, it's from the 1860s. And we're talking about the early 20th century here.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so for the listeners who don't know much about Mexican history, I think the big message that I would have for most people who don't know about it is, I would say, be careful, because I think what happens to most people in the U.S. is we have the illusion that we know more than we do, because we hear about Mexico in the news. We might go to Cancun or Los Cabos. We hear about the tourism. We hear about the problems on the border. We hear about narco trafficking. We hear about immigration issues. And so we're constantly hearing about it. So we kind of have the illusion that, it's ubiquitous, so we know about it. But really, it's a very interesting and rich history. And just absolutely fabulous. I wouldn't even know where to start to tell you about it, but the basic thing is that the 1910 revolution was formative. It's very important, and I think the message
and it sounds like it was a revolution of thought, kind of like the Russian Revolution was a revolution of thought. I mean, obviously, all the players changed, but the whole philosophy behind society changed.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And much of the Mexico was originally a colony of Spain. And before that, it was indigenous with various different groups, the most famous of which are the Aztecs, what's now Mexico City was their capital, Tenochtitlan. And that was a very large and important empire in the Americas. And the Spaniards came and conquered Tenochtitlan and made Mexico City, which is still the capital today. And the other group that's probably well known to many Americans are the Mayan in the Mayan Peninsula, which is a different group. There are many, many different groups of indigenous peoples, and Mexico's regions, ethnic groups, it's incredibly rich, incredibly diverse. I'll give a plug for one of my other books. As a translator, I edited a book of 24 Mexican writers in translation through selections of their work, giving a sense of a portrait of Mexico. So it's not saying these are the greatest Mexican writers, although some of them are, but it's 24 Mexican writers writing about Mexico to just give you a sense of the incredible diversity of the regions and the ethnic groups and the sensibilities. And that book is Mexico, A Traveler's Literary Companion. So I must plug that. But I think Mexico is far more interesting and complex and far more connected to the United States and coming back than we realize. And so coming back to the story of Madero, what's to me really outstanding, it's the first thing I talk about in the book, is I say the Mexican Revolution actually has some roots in upstate New York, which I think most people who have spent their lives reading about the Mexican Revolution would just kind of slap their foreheads or something or say, excuse me? That sounds really strange. But the truth is, Francisco Madero, as a spiritist, really believed that he was acting, he was performing his duty instructed by, guided by, and aided by the spirits. And his whole understanding of what it meant to be a spiritist has its roots in spiritualism, which has its roots in upstate New York.
Well, and I saw the whole thing about Poughkeepsie, which I'm thinking to myself, okay, so if I didn't grow up near there, I would never be able to pronounce it because I surely cannot spell it. And, well, I mean, I have family that lives there, you know, and I have to like look up their address because I'm like, there's too many letters. How would you even pronounce that with a Spanish accent?
I think they might have a little trouble pronouncing that. It's one of those things that's just spelled completely. It has a G in it, right? P-O-U-G-H, Poughkeepsie. He was Andrew Jackson Davis, the seer of Poughkeepsie, was an important. He prophesied the coming of spiritualism. This is in the 19th century. And in my retelling of it, I pretty much followed the standard history that you'll find in most histories of metaphysical religion, the history of spiritualism, that it really began with the Fox sisters in upstate New York, that their house was haunted, and they're just right after that, there began this huge fashion or fad, interest in summoning spirits, communicating with spirits. And one of the things was table tipping, where people would sit around a table and join hands so that they kind of could raise their energy and know that nobody was cheating. And the spirits would raise the tables or make the tables dance around, and other type of phenomena, let's say. And that really became very popular in the 19th century. And I came to Europe, and there were many very famous mediums that probably many of your listeners have heard of, you know, Didi Home, and then later Madame Blavatsky and the Eddy brothers, and, you know, the whole constellation of well-known mediums of the 19th century.
Wasn't that group the people that Harry Houdini was trying to debunk? Weren't they all right at the same time in our history?
That's right. And the connection with Madero is that all of this intense interest, which, you know, let's remember, this was also when people were discovering radio waves and, you know, using microscopes, and they were suddenly realizing, scientists were realizing that there were things that they couldn't hear with their ears or see with their eyes, but their instruments could tell them were real. So many people felt that, you know, the science of investigating psychic phenomena was something that many people began to take seriously at that time. William James, the father of psychology, and Richet, the French Nobel Prize winner, William Crookes, who is a famous chemist at University of Oxford. There were, let's say, a minority, definitely a minority. Just like today, there was a lot of skepticism and even hostility towards the investigation of psychic phenomena. But even then, I mean, I don't think things have changed that much in that regard. But there were important leading scientists who did take it seriously. And when some of these studies and some of the things that had been going on in upstate New York and elsewhere came to France, there was a educator who called himself Allan Kardec, who began to find this very interesting and to investigate it himself. And he sort of codified what we call Spiritism in a number of books. And so Spiritism, as it developed in France and then came to Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, the Philippines, and other parts of the world, really has its roots in spiritualism in upstate New York. That's an important root of that branch. So in that way, Madero, as a committed spiritist, well, there's some roots to these ideas in the not very distant past for him. He encountered Spiritism as a student in France. He got his high school and college education near Paris, or around near Versailles and in Paris. And that was where he discovered Spiritism and Kardec's works. And he was very quickly convinced, and he joined a group to develop his mediumistic powers. And he really was a very ardent evangelical spiritist.
Well, it sounds like he was a very well-educated man, too, to be able to, my concept of Mexico is that there are a lot of people that are, farmers or ranchers and just living a very basic life. And so to be able to bring that kind of spirituality in, you need to have kind of the space to do that.
He was a very well-off person. His grandfather was one of the wealthiest men in Mexico, and he had many, many different businesses, ranches, everything from soap factory to guayul, which was a kind of plant that they used in making tires for automobiles. And they had kind of every sort of business you could think of. So they were very, very wealthy people, and all the younger generation was educated in Paris and the United States. After he finished up there, he came to California and studied for a little while at UC Berkeley. And they often they were from the north of Mexico in Coahuila. So for them, the closest place to go was San Antonio. So they often went there and traveled in many places. So yeah, he was a very well-off man. And one of the things that was, coming back to how these things connect and how trends that were in the United States also came to Mexico and back and forth, it was just so interesting for me in doing the research for this book to go through his personal library that is in another archive here in Mexico City, in the Center for, it's called the Centro de Estudios de la Historia de Mexico, or the Center for Studying Mexican History. But his whole library, or most of what we know of, was his library is there, and it contains many books in English, many in French, and a good number that were translated by various people in Barcelona. Like a lot of the works of well-known people of that time, like Madame Blavatsky, were translated and sent in various editions throughout Latin America and to the Philippines. So it was really interesting to see how, he had books by Dr. Peebles, who was a very well-known, really celebrity speaker on the spiritualist circuit. People like that.
Well, all of this is going on. What was going on in Mexico at the time?
What was going on in Mexico? Well, that's something for 2 hours, but basically,
okay. Well, maybe not.
Well, the basic problem I think that most people would, the way most historians would put it at that time, was that the president of Mexico, who had been, continuously reelected for, with a brief introduction for about 30 years, he had a policy of inviting foreign investors. So many people in Mexico felt that too many foreigners owned too much land, they owned too much of the means of production, and the workers were getting a short end of the deal. So there were a lot of strikes. Some of them were very violent. There were a lot of problems about land, peasant uprisings, and that was what you saw in the state of Morelos with Emiliano Zapata, the guy with the big hat and the big mustache and the bandoliers. These were people who were wanting land that they felt that they were being crowded out by the large plantation sugar producers. So there was
it doesn't sound like anything has changed.
Well, I think
I don't mean in Mexico. I mean, in general in the world.
Well,
that was
these kinds of historical forces, they do repeat again and again throughout the world. That's certainly true. But there was definitely, I would say, unrest in the countryside, unrest in the cities among workers, among peasants, and also many of the younger generation of well-educated people really wanted to have open elections. And that was the call that Madero put forward. He said, 1910, there's an election. Let's have it be a real election, not just the dictator wins again with stuffed ballots. Let's have a real election. And that was what his call was for. And there were many, many people throughout the country, through all classes of society, who supported that call and who supported him for that reason. There were different factions in the revolution over the following years until things kind of settled down. But that's basically what was going on. I think... Go ahead.
No.
Ask, please.
Okay. Do you have any idea? I mean, let me start over again. Let me pull my question together. What kind of concepts did Francisco put forward?
Okay.
I mean, because you're saying
politically
spiritualist.
Politically, the main one was democracy, representative democracy, law, respect for the law and representative democracy. And he saw that as his duty as a spiritist. Now, what did he believe in Spiritism? Well, I'll give you two super quick answers to that. One is my understanding of what I picked up from translating him and reading about him, and that is that we are not our physical body, we are spirits, and as such we are immortal, and we are destined lifetime by lifetime, not by any ritual intermediated by clerics. So the Catholic Church did not approve of any of this, but by freely chosen good works to evolve into ever higher levels of consciousness and so return to God. That was what he was all about. And his words in the Spiritist Manual, which is meant to be an evangelical document to convert people, but also serve as reading for believers, he answers the question, what is understood by Spiritism? These are his words in my translation. Spiritism is the science concerned with investigating the powers of the human spirit, its past before arriving in this world, and its fortune upon abandoning it. So that is what he was all about.
And you brought this up in a couple of words, but how well was it received? I mean, there's what's going on with the church, but then we know that Mexico is a pretty Catholic Christian country.
That's right. The Catholic Church prohibits communicating with spirits. This is definitely not approved of by the Catholic Church, definitely not. At the time that he was president, it was an open rumor that he was a spiritist, and a lot of cartoons made fun of him as, a medium summoning spirits or something. But I think most people didn't believe it. They just thought, oh, it's just a political attack. And after the revolution, he's held up as a hero in all the textbooks. So they just kind of don't mention that he was a spiritist. It's just something most people didn't want to talk about. They just shoved it under the carpet. So
do you think when he was doing this political stuff, he, I'll use a contemporary term, came out of the closet about it?
No, he published the book under another name. The Spiritist Manual he published under the name Bhima, Bhima, which is a warrior in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu holy book, very popular, first popularized by the Theosophists. And he was not a Theosophist himself, but he was very influenced by the Theosophists. And many of his fellow Spiritists were also Theosophists. And for listeners who don't know about Theosophy, if you've heard of Madame Blavatsky, she was the big figure of Theosophy of the 19th century. But I think his Spiritism not only really informed what he did and why he did it, but I propose that it had a lot to do with his death. He was murdered. He was overthrown in a coup d'etat. And it was one of this is a fact. The general who overthrew him, the first communication that he made was to the U.S. ambassador in Mexico. And he asked the ambassador, should I send him to the lunatic asylum? because for many people then, just like today, if you say, I'm talking to spirits, no discussion, you're a nut. There's no concept that might be a real communication, or the person who is a medium may be perfectly sane. There was absolutely no understanding or acceptance of that. It was just, we know that they knew that he had published the Spiritist Manual. It was kind of a rumored thing, but his political enemies did know about it. And in fact, they had published part of it to say, look, he's crazy. This is what he published. And it's got chapters about table tipping and astral travel and reincarnation. And they were just, that's nuts. And I don't think that's necessarily nuts. My purpose was not to convince the reader of Spiritism or not. That's not my purpose. My purpose was simply to translate it and to say, look, we need to understand the context. Instead of saying he was a spiritist and shoving it under the carpet or making fun of it, I think we need to give the history of metaphysical religion its dignity. Just like if I'm not a Mormon, I wouldn't necessarily laugh at Mormons. I mean, everyone has their religion, and we can respect that and give it its dignity and talk about the history of that religion and why it was important to that person. We don't have to judge it necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I found that some of the things that he said were very well grounded, very well based in spirituality, and came from a kind and sincere heart. Well, except for all the Jesus part in it, which I had a little bit of issue with. But, considering the time it came from, it was appropriate, Well,
and I think that the intended reader of this book was presumably Catholic and presumably, say, a young student, someone, maybe a teenager or a young adult who was in a Catholic or predominantly Catholic society of the early 20th century. So that's the language. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's very interesting to me to hear you say that, because one of the great, I'm not sure surprise is the right word. What has really struck me now that the book is out is that people who are mediums, people who are spiritists or spiritualists, or who know a lot about metaphysics have all said that to me, that this book, his book, the Spiritist Manual, has, he's clearly a person who really was a good person and who really understood the mysteries. And that's very interesting to hear.
I mean, actually, I'm working on this new project, and part of it has to do with law and morals. And I was like, hey, because his one section where he's talking about morality, and I doubt I'll be able to just whoop up the page where I found it, because that would be, too easy. Oh, here it is. What is the objective of morality? And then the answer is, so you can understand from what I have just explained, morality is meant to give man the rules by which he may be happy. I like that. By which he may be happy, whether in his life or in space, according to his respective beliefs. And I thought that was just a very interesting, twist on it. Not the rules by which he should live, but the rules that he can be happy. Mm-hmm. I was like, that might make my book. Little quotey quote. So,
well, that would be wonderful.
And, people can and do have and live a very spiritual life, but work regular day jobs and, exist in the three-dimensional world, So, anyway.
Well, one of the things about Madero was that he originally formed himself, he had an education as a business person, but he studied hypnosis and he studied hands-on healing through his his mediumistic development and homeopathy. And I think that he viewed his activity as a politician and as a revolutionary and as president as a healer. I think he viewed himself as his mission was to heal the body politic. So I think that's another. Well, one of the things that I wanted to be sure to touch on, because I know you've got another interview after me that might relate with this and possibly add something to this, is that one of the really interesting things that I discovered in researching Madero and going through his personal library was a book by Maestro Huiracocha. And I just kind of scratched my head at that. I didn't know who that was. And I finally figured out that was Arnold Crumb Heller. And Arnold Crumb Heller was a fellow Mason and a fellow Rosicrucian. And Arnold Crumb Heller was a German spy, and he was an artillery expert. He played a very interesting and important role, little-known role in the Mexican Revolution. And he was also Madero's personal physician, although that may have been more a cover for him to communicate with the German embassy. But anyway, it was a very interesting thing there going on with that. And Dr. Crumb Heller, after the revolution, went on to have to play, I would say, an important role in esoteric the history of esoteric ideas. He was close with Aleister Crowley and some other important figures. And it turns out that he wrote a lot of books that I was able to track down some first editions through sellers on the internet that were really kind of fun. And some of them were published when he was in Mexico, but some of them afterwards, they were mostly in German or in Spanish. But he's actually a very well-known figure to many Germans and many people in Latin America. And so I thought it might be fun to ask your next guest about Dr. Crumb Heller.
Okay.
Because I only got so far with him. When we got to World War II, I just kind of lost track, and I thought, well, I got to finish my book. I'm going to go back to the Mexican Revolution. Right. But I think there's more to say about him. So, and another figure that Dr. Crumb Heller knew at some point was Rudolf Steiner, another great figure.
I've read one of Steiner's book, which I found fascinating, just fascinating. But I like reading old books, because
well, the thing is that
there's just a very different mentality at that period of time in history that I just appreciate, even if they are totally not politically correct. They're like the most not politically correct people on the planet. But
yeah. I don't think Crumb Heller was too politically correct now. But what I find super interesting here is that we get interconnections. So oftentimes, coming back to Mexico per se, is oftentimes when we hear about Mexican history or U.S. history or Texas history or German history or whatever it may be, it's almost like someone took a bell jar and kind of just put it on top of the thing, when actually the borders, it's far more fluid and interconnected and interwoven and tangled up. So, here we have a case where, an important German figure in the, German esoteric world is right there being the personal physician of the president of Mexico and a fellow Mason and a fellow Rosicrucian and a fellow spiritist. I think that's interesting. So, and again, the connections with some of the ideas coming out of New York in the second half of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I found interesting, not just in your book, but it just kind of brought this notion up, was the fascination that they had with mediumship during that period. Any thoughts on why that kind of just really came to the forefront?
I think it was part of, as I said, they first discovered, when they started developing things like the telephone, there was something called my French pronunciation fails me, the theater phone or the théâtre phone or something, where in Paris you could go to a hotel and for a coin, you could listen to the opera live elsewhere in the city. So it was kind of like an early kind of step towards the telephone. And I think that many people really felt that things like the telephone and radio waves and, the fact that you could, x-rays and see things in microscopes. And I think many people felt, whoa, there's something here. And I think also people have always wanted to communicate with their loved ones who have passed on. And I think that's always been something that's pulled at the human heart. And pulled at our curiosity as well. But I have to say, when I was reading about many of the mediums and things going on at that time, they seemed to me very different than what you come across today with most mediums today. More things like ectoplasm and floating trumpets. And another one of the things that I discovered when I was researching this book that just stopped me in my tracks for about a month. I mean, it literally left me speechless. I found a book called Una ventana al mundo invisible, which means a window to the invisible world. And it was published in the early 60s, so I didn't pay it much mind until I really looked at it. But what it is all the records of the Mexican Institute for Psychic Research conducted with one of the presidents who came after Madero, Plutarco Elias Calles, who was also a spiritist. And the records of these seances are very similar to what you would find with some of the seances going on in the late 19th century in the U.S. and in France and in England. Just, really wild, extremely wild.
But it sounds like they have funner politicians and funner news people in Mexico. I mean, I don't think, other than Ronald Reagan had an astrologer, which was scandalous. I don't think we had presidents that were mediums or, did stuff like that. And, Mexico, they're having all those UFO sightings and stuff. So there's something going on there, probably because they must be cooler people than the United States people.
Well, maybe. It may be.
Well, I mean, at least they're acknowledging them on the news instead of going, not so much. You're just loony,
Well, I think what I see here is that it's similar to the U.S., that there are people who are very open to discussing it and talking about it, but then there are many people who are not, and they're very hostile to it. And I think that's true on both sides of the border. Another interesting connection between the U.S. and Mexico that I talked about a little bit in the book, just when I wanted to go a little ways past Madero, just to give him a little context, where is he in terms of what happened before and afterwards. In the 70s, Andrija Pujarich came here with Uri Geller, who is probably well known to most of your listeners for spoon bending. And so
we had him on the show.
Yeah.
I had him on the show. He was pretty fun.
Uri Geller.
Uri. Make sure you say it right. Uri. I got an education in it.
Uri Geller. Okay, now I know.
Right from his mouth.
A lot of people in Mexico know about him. Yeah, but I think it's that's one of the reasons I like your show. I've listened to a lot of your shows over the years, by the way, and I like how the announcer would say at the beginning. I don't know if you still run this, but it would say, "Consider the possibilities." Just consider. Open your mind and just consider. And that's the stance I take with my book. I'm not trying to say you must believe in Spiritism or Spiritism is nutty. I'm not trying to say either one. I just want to say, well, he was a Spiritist. And what is that? And where did it come from?
On this show, it's kind of like, he was. Okay, moving on.
Yeah. Well, I think for many of the subjects you consider on your show, this definitely fits in. I mean, the table tipping, psychokinetic phenomena, astral travel, communicating with the dead. It's all in there. Reincarnation, alternative history of humanity.
Another source. We've lost all. it's not that we've lost. There's so much material that either isn't written in English and has not been translated, as you found.
Yeah.
Or if they are books from the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, they don't get put into like archive.org. And so if you're not familiar with the title, I mean, you've rattled off several titles and authors that I've never heard of, and they're just kind of lost. And so you've given him life again.
Yeah, they were new. They were new to me, and I went through the material on the Revolution, and it wasn't in there, or it was in a very obscure footnote. It wasn't known, and I think coming back to what I was saying about Mexico, very little is translated, and we really in English. Many people have heard of Octavio Paz because he won the Nobel Prize, or Carlos Fuentes because he published many novels and was very prominent. But most people English speakers have not heard or are not even aware that there is this very large and very distinguished centuries-long tradition of literary production in Mexico. In fact, the first printing press was in Mexico 100 years before it showed up in Boston. I mean, there is a big tradition of writing and publishing in Mexico. And this is really off the radar for most people in the United States. And because they don't know that, it colors how they think of Mexico. And that was why I offered to translate the book. When I saw the book, I had been given I explain in the book, I had been given a private tour of the archive of Madero, which anyone can consult, any serious researcher can consult. I didn't have any privilege in that regard, but I was given a private tour of what was there. And when I saw that, I just realized I'm sure nobody's translated that. And, like I said, no matter what's in it, just because he led the revolution and he was president, it's important. I mean, it could be recipes for corn muffins, and it would be important because he was important. And so I said, well, I'll translate it. And one of the reasons I said that was, well, it wasn't that long, and I didn't think it would be that difficult, ironic laugh. I didn't think it was that, because technically it's not difficult to translate, but the concepts took a lot of work. But the thing was, I knew if I didn't do it, probably 100 years would go by before somebody would do it. Or maybe they would run it through the Google Translator robot, which would just be a horror show. So,
no kidding.
So I thought, well, if I don't do it, it isn't going to happen. And I'm a translator. I've translated a lot of Mexican writers. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll do it. It was just a way of saying thank you for the tour of the archive, and also thank you just to Mexico that, I know this is an important document, and I'll add value by just doing this. And it was just, I just volunteered to do it. And then I realized I had a book. I realized, my plan was to just publish the translation with a couple pages of introduction, but I realized that was completely inadequate. I really needed to explain the context of who he was and the history of Spiritism and, how it connects with all these ideas. But, another thing that I think is important to point out that might be especially interesting for the listeners is that many of these ideas that we think of as new, particularly if you're new to metaphysics and you're, coming online and listening to podcasts and videos and, buying books at Barnes & Noble or Amazon and, kind of delving in, many of these ideas that might seem new have a very rich history, and knowing where they come from and who first proposed them and who influenced them to bring these ideas forth, I think really enriches one's understanding and reflection of many of these ideas.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think we haven't heard of him particularly? I mean, you're right. We've all heard of Pancho Villa. He's in every Mexican restaurant.
Why
not?
Well,
so much?
I think Pancho Villa is far more cinematic. If you were going to make a movie, you'd put Pancho Villa in it before you'd put Francisco Madero. Francisco Madero was a gentleman. He was, an entrepreneur. He had many businesses. He wore a top hat. He was educated in France. He was very wealthy. He's not a romantic figure of the revolution the way someone like Zapata or Villa is. And I think that's one reason.
But he doesn't even have like a supporting role.
Well, he does. If you come to Mexico and you go to the National Palace, I assure you, you will see his portrait many times. It's painted into all the important murals, and he's, if you come through any museum of Mexican history or you get any textbook on Mexico, he's a very prominent figure.
Okay.
Yeah, very prominent. Really, I do think he's a different role in a different period, but I think he's one of the figures of Mexican history that is comparable for us to George Washington or Abraham Lincoln.
Really?
Yeah, really. Yeah, really. Or FDR. He's a major figure. Every Mexican school child has heard of him.
But did he cut down a cherry tree?
I
mean, come on.
Yeah.
So let me ask, and this is kind of personal. I mean, not personal, but to you, what did you find as being profound or compelling in his writing? What did you take from it?
What I took from it is something another historian has pointed out, so I'm not original in saying this, but it was something I kind of figured out on my own, is that his political career is modeled on his career, I guess if you could call it that, as a spiritist. In other words, the way that they organized Spiritism was they would put together groups of people, circles, that would meet usually in private homes. A group of people around a table would practice their mediumship or have a seance or evaluate each other's ability to do things. But it was very private, and of course, because the Catholic Church did not approve of it, it was very under the radar. And this was also true in other countries. I don't think Mexico is unique in that regard, that spiritualists like spiritists would often meet in private in small circles. But then what they would do is they would have publications like Helios or the Cruz Astral or different things like that. And Madero, with his own money, often sponsored these kinds of publications. And then they would have a Congress. They would have a national Congress, or they would have a Latin American Congress. Well, the way he went about his political career was identical. He put together different groups of people, circles of people in different places. He went all around the republic, organizing people to come together in small groups. He published a book, which is also something that comes up in all the Mexican textbooks. It's his most famous book, and he published it right before the Spiritist Manual. It's called La Sucesión Presidencial en 1910. In other words, the presidential succession of 1910. So that was where he was calling for free elections in 1910. And that book was his political platform. So he self-published it. He didn't try to sell it. It, of course, would have been confiscated. He just gave it away to all these people, so the secret police couldn't confiscate it. It was too late. It was already in the hands of all these journalists and all these people. And that was his platform, and people started organizing in little groups, just like the Spiritist groups, and then coming together in a national party Congress. So then that party, when they had its Congress, chose him as their candidate for president. So the organization, his political organization, followed the religious organization. They go hand in hand. They are inseparable. It's not like you could just look at his revolutionary or political activity apart from the Spiritism. They are hand in hand.
Do you think his beliefs are what got him killed, or do you think there were other things going on?
I think they were part of what. Yeah, I think that they played a more important part than most people recognize in people who were close to him, like General Huerta, who was the general who overthrew him, and other people. I think it sort of fed the flames of their resentment and disgust with him. They really didn't like him, but there were reasons that I think that they didn't like him apart from his Spiritism. One was that he was from the North, So he was really an outsider. And the people that he brought with him were really outsiders. And another thing that I think is also very important to take into account is that after any revolution, pretty much anywhere in the world, at any time in history, when the new government comes in, it's weak, because it's new. And the state apparatus is weakened because it's had to fight a revolution. And if it weren't weak, it wouldn't have fallen. So just by its nature, a new government after a revolution is going to be weak, and there will probably be a counter-revolution. So that counter-revolution is something that, it's kind of political science 101. Someone in the army would have gotten up an attempt to overthrow him. So there's that too. I think that many people, when they talk about why he fell, they'll say, oh, he was a dreamer. He was off translating the Bhagavad Gita, and, like he was just this really flaky guy. And I don't think that's fair. I think if you really understand the context and the history of his ideas, I don't think that's really fair. And I think if you look at how he organized his political campaigns and organized the revolution, I think you really have to conclude that he was a very capable leader and manager. But he was in a very weak position as the post-revolutionary president. By its nature, that was a very weak position to be in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. It's just sad. I mean, politics is just sad.
Well, it was
in all of its aspects. It's sad.
Yeah, it was a sad end. It really was. He was arrested in the National Palace and held prisoner for several days while they basically destroyed the city, the downtown of the city, and then he was just shot in the back of the head. It was really a pretty horrible story.
Okay. And so they arrest the president and then shoot him in the back of the head. Wasn't there any kind of an outcry from the people? There
certainly was. And one of the most interesting, I love doing archival research, if you didn't notice. I love going into archives and libraries. And one of the most interesting things was going to the one in Washington, D.C., the House of the Temple Library in Washington, D.C. It's a really extraordinary place. And if any of you listening haven't been there, you can come in and have a tour. It's just like going into a movie set. It is just so fun and interesting. It's on 14th Street, if I remember correctly, in Washington, D.C., and it looks like just this thing out of the ancient world. It's just a most extraordinary building. And you come in, and it's kind of like an Egyptian temple. Well, they have in there a special section on Mexican masonry. And the librarian, Larissa Watkins, bless her heart, I call her my library angel. She helped me so much. She took me down to the basement and, opened with a key the little cabinet with all the special books on Mexican masonry. And she also brought to me the magazines in English of the Masons that were absolutely outraged at the murder of Brother Madero. So that was very interesting also to see that there really was an outrage in the U.S. And the U.S. ambassador at the time, his name was Henry Lane Wilson. Same name as the president, Woodrow Wilson, who came in shortly thereafter, but they're not related that I know of. He was very friendly to the previous regime. He knew that Madero was a spiritist, and he found that he did not respect that. He considered Madero crazy just because, according to him, anyone who communicated with spirits was crazy, period. So he was very happy to have Madero go. And Huerta, the general who overthrew Madero, was also communicating with him. And so in Mexican history, Ambassador Wilson is a big villain, unfortunately. But when President Woodrow Wilson came into office, shortly thereafter, he immediately recalled the ambassador and sent down someone else. And so the U.S. government did not approve of any of this.
ACM?
Yeah.
I just looked at the clock. Actually, I just got a little heads up. We are out of time.
Well, it is such a pleasure to talk about this with you, Dr. Rita. Thank you so much.
Oh, you are so welcome. And I'm sure I will talk to you again soon.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
That's C.M. Mayo. Her book is Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution. Her webpage is cmmayo.com. Her book is available at all major books publishers, and I'm sure Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. And I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.